Okay, so we are picking up today with Spanish colonization in the Americas. So we have worked our way through early American civilizations and the fall of the civilizations. So now we're going to basically look and see how the Spanish start building their empires in these colonies in the Americas. So a little bit of this is going to be review from exploration and then early American civilizations. And then we'll talk about how the Spanish kind of established and set up their colonies and their empire in the Americas. All right, so if you remember all the way back from, like Unit 4, we talked about explorers during the Age of Exploration. And so in 1492, Columbus, who sailed for Spain, was looking for a new route to India and ended up coming upon the Americas. And so basically, Spain then turns these islands into what we call colonies. So colonies are basically lands in another area that are controlled by a foreign nation. So the Americas were a colony for Spain, and then several other European nations are going to do the same thing. Like the British are going to colonize in North America. The French are going to do the same thing. So the Spanish, because they make it to Central and South America first, this is where they're going to start setting up their colonies and controlling those areas. So colonies are lands in another area that are controlled by a foreign nation, or sometimes we'll call it a mother country. All right, so we've already talked about Cortés and Pizarro, but just a little recap. After Columbus expanded into the Americas and discovered the Americas, Spain sent conquistadors, or Spanish explorers and conquerors. They're militarymen, really. They're not just explorers, but they come with a military. And we've already learned a little bit about that. But Cortés comes in to find the Aztec Empire in Central America and takes over the Aztec Empire, takes over that area and defeats the Aztecs with the help of other native tribes. If you remember, he formed alliances with some of the other native tribes that the Aztecs had oppressed and kind of treated very harshly and, defeated in military or warfare. Pizarro, after studying some of Cortez's writings, really did the same thing in the Inca Empire. When he got to the Andes mountain range, which is now in modern-day Peru, he used a lot of the same tactics that Cortés did. So he made alliances with some of the tribes in that area, and they were able to conquer the Inca. Now, also disease obviously played a huge part in this because the native people in those areas were not previously exposed to diseases like smallpox and measles, and so they didn't have immunity to it. And so disease kind of helps the Spanish conquer the tribes in these areas. Because remember, the Spanish are coming in, and they're not coming in with these massive militaries. They're coming in actually with a very small portion of people. So compared to the number of the indigenous tribes that are there, the Spanish are outnumbered, but because of their military technology, because of the disease, because of the tactics that they use with the alliances, this is what makes the Spanish successful in taking over those particular areas. Okay, so once Spain has established those areas as its colonies, it's important to note that even though disease and warfare obviously wipes out a good portion of that population of these indigenous tribes, of the Indians living there, they don't completely wipe it out. In fact, they are going to use the people in that area to, again, like build and establish their colonies. So the Spanish actually start to impose their culture on the Native Americans living there by encouraging them to intermarry, and also by way of the Encomienda system. So we're going to talk about both of those, how the Spanish kind of used both of those to build their empire. So again, the first one we're going to focus on is kind of this process of intermarrying of people between the Spanish and the indigenous Native Americans who are there. And what this does is it sets up a social class system based on race because of, again, the intermarrying and the mixing of ethnicities here. And so this is the early colonial society in which your social class is based on your birth. So obviously at the top of the social class system in the Americas, okay, so remember this only applies to the Americas in areas of like Spanish colonies, where at the top we have people called the Peninsulares, and those are people who have come from Spain. So they are Spanish, they have come over from Spain to establish and help colonize in the Americas. So they are at the top. And then below them are Creoles. And Creoles are Spaniards who are born in Latin America. So basically both their parents are Spanish, and they then have children who are born in America. So they are ethnically, again, Spanish. They don't have any kind of mixing of blood. They're just their place of birth is different. And then you have mestizos. So this is kind of where the intermixing of cultures and ethnicities comes in. So mestizo means that you are European with Indian ancestry, meaning that, one of your parents is European and the other is Indian, most likely European male, Indian female. And then during this time, this is when the Atlantic slave trade is also occurring. So the next social class we have are mulattoes, which is European ancestry mixed with African ancestry. Okay, so the mixing of Europeans and Africans, that makes the next social class mulattoes. And then you have just Africans. So a majority of them are enslaved. So, because again, we have the African slave trade that is taking place. And then at the bottom, we have Indians. And that's because they are, it says here, of little economic value. And that's because the Indians really could not, fight off the diseases from the Europeans. Also, the hard labor had depleted a number of the Indian population. The Africans had already been exposed to a lot of the diseases that the Europeans had. So this is why you see the Africans kind of, I guess you could say favored, not really, but this is why they're positioned above the Indians. It's because basically they are, they're able to survive better than the Indians are under Spanish rule. Okay. So while living amongst the Native Americans, we know that the Spanish also oppressed them by use of what's called the Encomienda system. So I would highlight this right here. So the Encomienda system was basically the Spanish labor system that the Spanish got the approval to use from the Catholic Church. So I'm going to talk to you in a second about how that worked. But basically, the exchange that was supposed to take place was that the Spanish were supposed to Christianize and protect the natives in exchange for the natives' labor, kind of teaching the Spanish how to, again, live on the land, work there, etc., and establish their colony in that area to make it successful. The Encomienda does not necessarily work like that. And it ends up being a really harsh labor system that lasts until the mid 1500s, until the Catholic Church says you cannot use this in the Catholic Church's name. So here's how the Encomienda worked. So here's how it's supposed to work, the plan. Okay. Spanish settlers were supposed to protect, care, and Christianize Indians. Okay. On a piece of land. So maybe the Spanish were given a piece of land. On that land would be the Indians. And then the Spanish were supposed to protect the Indians and Christianize them. So this is kind of like the key part for the Catholic Church. You're supposed to Christianize them in exchange for the Indians working for just a portion of their time for the Spanish. Okay, so remember, the idea behind this was supposed to be that they would help the Spanish kind of establish themselves here in the Americas. But the reality of this is that Spanish settlers ended up forcing long and harsh labor on the Indians. They didn't pay them. They failed to protect them. Again, a number of them died from harsh diseases and from the extended long labor that they forced them to do. So remember, I said like Indians really weren't used to a lot of the harsh labor, and this is why. It's because they're forced to work these incredibly long hours in harsh conditions. And so a number of Indians end up dying from disease and the harsh living and working conditions that are imposed upon them. So finally, in 1542, which remember, this is again happening at the same time as the Protestant Reformation, when the Catholic Church realizes that this is the harsh reality of the Encomienda system, they tell the Spanish basically that they cannot use the Encomienda anymore. Basically, they can't use it in the name of Christianization anymore. So the Encomienda ends in 1542. That's abolished, but the Spanish continued to use this particular method, this harsh reality right here, this system, and abuse, and they replace it with the repartimiento. Sorry, I'm not a Spanish-speaking individual, but they replace it basically with the same system. It's just not called the Encomienda anymore. So they're not using it in the name of Christianization. They're simply using it in the name of please do this harsh labor, or not really please, but you have to do this harsh labor in order to survive. So this is how the Spanish start to set up their colonies. So again, you need to know what the encomienda is. And you also need to be able to identify the different social classes here and know what each of them are. So you have to know the difference between peninsulares, Creoles, mestizos, mulattoes. You have to know what each one is in the correct order. Okay, so that's where we are going to stop for today.